By now you've probably seen the headlines, right? That key US staff who worked in Marvel Rivals have been laid off, and that does include Thaddeus Sasser, a man who in press interviews was labeled as game director. But that is actually not the full story here. It's a lot of things, and one of the many things that it is a continuing trend. Success does not guarantee safety. And with this game, I mean, Marvel Rivals hit 20 million players in 2 weeks. And even now, analytics firm Circana is reporting that it is still in the top 5 most engaged games in the US across all platforms, which is absolutely insane levels of performance for basically a new game. So this is a game that is on fire in a good way, and its development team is absolutely not slacking. There are new characters dropping, there's much wanted quality of life features making their way to the game, and then this story. What I'm going to do first is explain what actually happened and all of the context, but then there has been reporting. People within Netease have talked, and that means that this story does go a little bit larger than one Seattle-based team. It all began when Thaddeus Sasser made this LinkedIn post announcing that him and his team were laid off, which to many people was genuinely shocking. That's because weeks and months ago, Thaddeus was doing press junkets as game director, right? And certainly if he wasn't the game director, it would have been a little bit strange if Netease just let him call himself the game director at PR things likely set up by Netease. Now, Thaddeus has worked on loads of different things: Call of Duty, Ghost Recon, Battlefield, but most will know him from Concord, not because he worked on it. Specifically this interview where he observed, and this was before the launch of Concord, that it did not have enough, quote, unique value to move people away from Overwatch. He was absolutely right. And he went on to say, if we've done our jobs well, they'll love what they play and they'll want to play some more. And, spoiler alert with Rivals, they did want to play more. Now, in this LinkedIn post, he says this is such a weird industry. My stellar, talented team just helped deliver an incredibly successful new franchise in Marvel Rivals for Netease Games. And we're just laid off. Oh well, times are tough all over. Let's find these incredible people new jobs because we all need to eat, right? Certainly quite the grim post. Now, he goes on to shout out his teammates, and per second wins digging, this entire team in the US amounts to 6 people, right? That's including Thaddeus. Now, the reactions to this were wild. As an example, I tweeted Netease just laid off the game director of Marvel Rivals as well as his Seattle-based team. Because, look, game director was actually Thaddeus's job title. And the whole thing did make sense. I mean, I think almost all of us knew that this game was, by and large, developed in China, but the idea of having Westerners shape a game that would launch in the West is certainly not a wild one, and it probably is what happened. Now, many people were very quick to downplay this Seattle-based team, saying that they were merely a support team, or that Thaddeus was in fact not the game director. People then pointed to this video, which is quite an interesting one. I mean, it's actually good, it's full of really interesting game updates, and it's hosted by the creative director of Marvel Rivals, Guanyang Chen. Now, of course, every project has got multiple director-level roles, so to have a game director and a creative director is entirely normal, which is basically to say that Guanyang Chen being the creative director doesn't mean that somebody else wasn't game director, because in most projects those are in fact 2 different roles. Now, what would clarify all of this, right? It's just looking at the game credits. But there actually aren't any. Yes, Netease have provided no credits for this game. There's no menu in Marvel Rivals where you can see a list of credits, and that does mean that we don't actually have firm details on who even made this thing. Now, what we do have is some reporting. There's some from Patrick Dane, and it does suggest that both men were leading teams on either side of the Pacific. Then Kazuma Hashimoto, who interviewed Thaddeus, suggests that the US team additionally played an important role in communicating with stakeholders at Marvel and Disney. Which obviously makes sense. They're both in the US, they share a time zone. What is clear anyway is that this US team, which did have people with pretty damn senior job titles, is no longer a thing. And responding to all of this, we have now got Netease's official statement. The statement is clear in intent, but honestly it's kind of fluffy, there's some weasel words, but basically to sum them up, they say that the Seattle team was cut for efficiency. They were a, quote, design team, and Netease is currently investing more money in Marvel Rivals, not less, which certainly makes sense and will be good news for the players. And there is actually a real clear surface level logic to this, right? This is a worldwide live service title leveraging Western IP. That means that it will obviously have a massive benefit from genre-experienced Americans influencing its design and a lot of those top-level sorts of decisions, while also working with the predominantly American stakeholders who control the IP. That makes a lot of sense when you're shaping a game like this and when it's in production. It's the fundamental design constraints that lead to the launch. But beyond the launch, do you actually need those people? Because beyond the launch, you already have your game. It's now about producing more game, optimizing your costs, all of that stuff, and the vast bulk of development has always been in China for this title. So this logic, while I'd say it's a little bit surface level, does by and large fit and make sense, but it doesn't fit everything. As an example, Netease says that this team was, quote, part of a larger global design function. Which does then beg the question, why just cut the Americans and not other people in this global design function? You could certainly say that as soon as you're dealing with international, well, whether it's America or Europe, you're still coordinating across time zones, and these Americans were both embedded in the project, so you wouldn't have to get them up to speed, and also they share working hours with Disney and Marvel, which you would have thought would be pretty handy if you're working on Marvel Rivals. Now, to that end, actually, I do have some explanations. Number one, first explanation, there is a wider trend of US and North America-based development suffering, right? And it is suffering more than other development clusters in the world are suffering, and that is owing to high wages and cost of living versus other regions. There are other factors as well. As an example, US tech has tended to pay extremely well, but also does compete for some of the same talent pool, which means that if you're a games company, it's pretty hard to get people when they could go to FANG and get a hell of a lot more money. Second then, US audiences are proven to buy non-US developed games. As an example, Cyberpunk, Baldur's Gate 3, or for today, Black Myth Wukong. If you don't need to pay American salaries to access the American market and American dollars, why bother? Third, of course, geopolitical tensions. There's talk about, tariffs and everything. But fourth, the bigger point. Netease's rather abundantly obvious actions and some additional sourcing. Full credit to our researcher Connor for coining this whole segment, Journey from the West. Fucking legendary. But okay, here's the deal. Today's story is actually tiny compared to the North American cuts that Netease have already made. As an example, Worlds Untold is a studio led by Mass Effect writer Mac Walters, pretty big guy in Mass Effect. They had their Netease funding pulled after just a year. There's Jar of Sparks, who had their Netease funding pulled after 2 years. And to be fair, it's not just the United States and Canada, right? You've got Oka Studios. They fired all of their staff the very same week they released Visions of Mana, and that was all part of Netease divesting from the Japanese market. So, with all of this going on and the story that sparked today's video, GamesBeat dug around, they talked to sources, and they came to a little bit more of an understanding of what's going on. Now, Netease did deny the claim that they are actively divesting from overseas developers, right? But obviously, they were given the right of reply for this story, and they would deny. Actions, though, speak a little bit louder than words, and GamesBeat sources claim interesting things. As an example, one said that the Rivals US team cut is just the start. Netease set out to grow their international revenue to 50%, and their Seattle-based head of investments, Simon Zhu, would be, acting accordingly and making those investments. As to the why of that 50%, well, you probably remember some of the news stories a few years ago where there was a lot of regulation on the video games market domestically in China, and you saw a lot of these companies really try to spread their wings internationally, which would basically mean they'd have less financial risk because of local regulation and that kind of thing. But anyway, this led, the actions of Simon Zhu making these investments to a wave of new Netease sort of funded studios headed up by Western vets. As an example, you've got ex-World of Warcraft, League of Legends, and Riot MMO designer Greg Street, most known as Ghostcrawler, who founded Fantastic Pixel Castle. There's Jackalyptic Games, there's Anchor Point Studios, and there are of course others like the two that had their funding pool that I mentioned at the top of this segment. I think rather worryingly for just about everybody involved, the article goes on to lay out that basically everything that Simon Zhu got to work on with these investments over 2 years is basically going to be wound down. Now, for what it's worth, Greg Street of Fantastic Pixel Castle did basically tweet, we're fine, we're still hiring, so who really knows there? Now, to continue with some of this reporting, there's one man that we need to talk about. He's called William Ding, and he is the CEO of Netease. Now, a source told GamesBeat that William sees overseas development investments as being too expensive, and that, quoting the article, everything that Zhu touched is going to be unwound. Now, we've obviously already seen sizable North American studios die. Today, we've seen the United States, Seattle-based Rivals team go. If this is to be believed, there is far worse to come. And yes, Ghostcrawler did tweet that, but this sourcing does sort of go against what he's tweeted. It could also, of course, be that while the source said everything that Zhu touched is going to be unwound, that everything was a little bit of an exaggeration, and perhaps some of the stronger bets, like Ghostcrawler Studio, may indeed survive. But big picture, right? The problem here is there is no money in video games compared to just a few years ago. Compared really is the operative word there. Games was flushed with cash, there were many investments, and a lot of American salaries were going to the goddamn moon. I have heard tales of senior animation roles going for 300 grand at the peak of things in California, which is crazy compared to the norm. Of course, what we've got today is publishers crashing and burning, and when I say that, you're going to think of Electronic Arts, Take-Two, etc. What I'm actually thinking of is AA and indies. And the point basically is, across the whole chain, yeah, there's going to be no bounce back. And that's a deeper problem than many would first think, because the last 5 years saw waves of veterans take their chance, right? The idea being you worked at Blizzard, you worked at Infinity Ward, whatever it may be, right? You put in your 10 years, your 15 years, you earned your wings, and now you have an opportunity to start a studio. What should have been, right, a wave of new competition, new blood, new studios led by veterans has by and large actually fizzled out, and many of them haven't even lasted long enough to get games out the door. And what that essentially means is what should have been the next generation of great studios that would foster growth into the future, new creativity, disruption in the market, which is what benefits us as consumers. That's kind of fizzled out. And it's not a short-term blip, it's ecosystem-wide collapse. I only say that latter bit because the money has dried up. It's not like all of these people are losing jobs, but can go and easily get a new one. It's not like that at all. But of course there is one thing. Above all, one very important thing, the line. And as we all know, the line must go up. So let's talk about that. Netease's Q4 profits released the day of this video's publication, and just 2 days after the layoffs were announced. And this is another example of a very common pattern, a public display of short-term financial prudence, right in time for the quarterly report that goes to the investors. You see, last report, Netease made $3 billion from games. That's pretty awesome. That's actually really bad because that was a 4.2% year-on-year decrease. Oh dear, that's not a good direction of travel. Now, this time, of course, they don't just have Marvel Rivals counting in their favor. They've also got the continued results of World of Warcraft and Hearthstone relaunching into China. There's Naraka Blade Point, and of course, in the future, there's going to be Overwatch 2 launching into China, where I suppose it'll be fighting with Rivals, which they also own. Anyway, the real thrust of things here is that as much as Rivals is indeed set to be a multi-billion revenue-generating project for years and years to come, those 6 Seattle staff holding titles such as Game Director are, at the end of the day, a line item. Because if those sources are to be believed, Big William wants to move out of the States, move out of the international development investments, and that means that these people are gone. And you can absolutely make the argument that short-term, you do not need these people, right? You needed them to get where you are, but you don't need them anymore because you can just bulk up a team in a cheaper country and away you go, off to the races. But it could be the case that the expertise that helped you get to where you are could be useful in the future. And if we always make short-term, very line item and optimizing the details but missing the bigger picture style cuts and changes, well, who's to say what things in the future we do not see? And speaking, I suppose, if my capitalist hat on, who's to say what shareholder value we're not getting because we're making all of these short-term cuts? And the off chance that me saying that just literally made you sick, watch this video next. It's a great example of shareholder value being destroyed. So you might have fun.